Welcome to You Suck at Coding. Let's try and change that, shall we? So today we'll be learning how to set up a MERN Stack project. MERN is an acronym for MongoDB, Express, React, and NodeJS. So in order to get started, we will open up Chrome and go to the NodeJS official website, which is nodejs.org. It automatically detects my operating system and brings me to the download page. We'll be using the long-term support version, which at this time is 14.18.0, recommended for most users. Clicking on this should download the package automatically, and then this brings us to the installer, which is a fairly easy process. I already have a version of Node installed, so I won't be doing that. So assuming that we have Node already installed, let's close this and open up the terminal. All right, here we go. Let's make this full screen. So now what we're going to do is go to the directory where we want to set up a project. The project is going to be set up in two parts, the front end being client and the back end being server. So let's get started with that. Let's go cd, YouTube, projects. Let's do an ls to see if it's clean. All right. So I'm going to make a directory and call it MERN-setup. And now let's go inside the MERN setup and we'll get started with React first. So for that, we'll be calling it client, as I mentioned earlier. We'll be using a command npx. Npx, if you have npm, you have npx. Npx create React app. And now you can enter the name of the project, whatever you want to call it. We'll go with client and press enter. And this should basically do all of the heavy lifting and give us a nice and clean version of a React app setup. It'll take probably 20 to 30 seconds to do this. So we'll be back once that is done. All right, so we have the create React app project set up now. Let's go to cd client and open up VS Code, which is the code editor that we'll be using today. So for that, I'm going to use a command code space dot, and this is going to open VS Code inside of the client directory. Let's make this full screen. So it has the node modules, public and source. Inside of source, there is a file called app.js. You'll see that it is capitalized, which means that it's a React component and not just a JavaScript file. I mean, it is a JavaScript file, but it's a React component. So what I like to do is rename it with an extension of .jsx, just so there's a clear distinction between the JavaScript and the React files. So we'll name it app.jsx, and we open this up. Let's fire up the terminal, and we'll do an npm start, which basically starts the project and opens it up in Google Chrome or whatever your default browser is. Get this to the right, open VS Code on the left, and this is the starter files for the React app. So now what we're going to do is clean up the project a bit. So what I like to do is clear everything between the main div, and then perhaps what we could do is add an h1 just so we know it's working. So we add h1. Let's go with the classic hello world, and it's at the center, which means that there's some CSS. So we get rid of the logo as well. Now that we're cleaning it, let the app.css file be there. Inside of it, let's get rid of all the styling, and it brings it to the left. There's still some margin at the top. So what I like to do is go to index.css, and inside of that, just add star, curly brackets, and then add a margin auto. And that should get rid of the margin top from here. And now let's get rid of some of the extra files. We'll delete the logo. Let's delete that. And there are some test files that we can just leave, although we won't be writing any tests for this tutorial. And that is about it for cleaning up and setting the React app. That is fairly simple. And now what we're going to do is move on to the backend, which we'll be calling server. All right, let's open up the terminal I'm just gonna minimize that for now since we won't be needing this. Here is the terminal. Let's bring it back. Let's go back to the MERN setup and create a directory called server. Inside of the server, we'll be using a command npm init, which is initialize. Now that I click it, it says package name server. That's fine. We press enter. Version description. Let's call it backend for MERN setup YouTube tutorial. Perfect. Entry point. Index.js. You could name it anything else. What I like to call it is app.js, just so there's a similarity between the front end and the back end. So I'll be calling it app.js. No test commands. You can connect it with the Git repository. We won't be doing that today. Press enter. No keywords. Author. Let's go with the channel name. Licenses, and this is how the package.json file is going to look. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's go and type yes, press enter, and we have the initial files for the server ready now. So what I'm going to do now is open the VS Code inside of the MERN setup project and not the server or the client, so that we have access to both of them. So I'll do a code dot here. This opens up a new VS Code window. We can get rid of the earlier one, and I guess we won't be needing the terminal now, so I'm going to close this one. Let's get rid of this, and let's open this up and make this full screen. All right. Perfect. So we have a folder server here now, which has a package.json, this information that we saw earlier. So how we'll be starting is create that file, app.js, and we can get to coding. So inside of app.js, how I like to divide this is add some comments first. So let's write import modules. We'll be importing all of the packages like Express, Mongoose over here. Let's do an app. This is where we'll be adding the MongoDB using Mongoose. Any middleware. And then we have the routes. This is where we'll be importing the routes and then using them. And then there's an extra step of port. All right, so let's get started with the first one, which is modules. So we'll be needing Express, Mongoose, obviously for the backend and the database. We'll be installing some middlewares as well. So before we import that, we have to install them. And for that, I'm going to open up the terminal inside of VS Code. And this time, go inside server. And here I'm going to do npm install, with the short form of which is npm I, and we're installing Express, Mongoose. We need Morgan, which basically logs the requests, so it helps us, during debugging and checking the results. We'll be using cores for communicating between the front end and the back end. We'll also be using .env, which is basically a good practice to store all of the sensitive information that you don't want to upload to the repository. If you're connected to GitHub, GitLab, or any of the other. We also need NodeMon. So NodeMon, basically what it does is it allows the backend to continuously run, so that if there's any changes, we don't have to do an npm start again and again. It's basically a hot reloading, similar to what React has, but for Node.js. So we'll be installing all of these dependencies. That should not take long. And yeah, perfect. You could also open multiple terminals. So I'm gonna keep this one for server, open up a different one for client, do an npm start there, so it's running already. So this is where it is. Just gonna minimize this for now, and then yeah, that's about it. So inside of server, we can now start importing the modules that we just installed but they can also be seen inside of the packet.json now. This is where they are. I'm going to go to app.js and start with importing some of the modules. So Express, let's go with Mongoose next. Let's do Morgan, course, and then the .env, where we will be storing the port and the Mongo URI for this tutorial. So .env.config, and that should set it up nice and clean. Let's create an app. So it will be const app is equal to express. That creates an app. We'll be dealing with DB a little later. First, let's do app.use and set up the middlewares. So Morgan, and let's do dev. Inside of it is an argument. App.use, let's do course. So like I said before, it's so that we could communicate from this backend to the front end that we set up earlier. Origin true, and let's do credentials include. That is if you're sending some information. And what else? I guess that's it for the middlewares for now. We'll deal with routes a little later once we create one, create a test API. And inside of the port, let's do const, if I can type, const port is equal to, so I like to use 8080 for the backend. So you could just leave it here. But if you have a port that you are defining inside of your .env file, which I'll be creating next, what you can do is access it via process.env, and then whatever it is that you have defined it with. So I'll be using capital PORT. So if it's available, then use that. Otherwise, it could just simply refer to 8080 as the port. And now let's set up the, I forgot, the listener. Let's do a const server and app.listen. So this is where the port goes, and then we have a function, an arrow function. We don't need the curly braces. That basically does a console log so that we know it's working. So the console log can be server is running on port, whatever the port is. Okay, so we could do an npm start, but I mentioned NodeMon earlier. So what NodeMon does is hot reloading. So in order to add that, what I like to do is in the scripts, add the key start, and inside of that, I'm going to add the command. So that will be NodeMon app.js. So every time we run npm start, which will be similar for the client and the server now, for the backend, it will do NodeMon app.js automatically. So let's do an npm start and see this in the works. Yes, it says server is running on port 8080. Perfect. Now we can get started with setting up the database. So for this one, we'll be using the MongoDB Atlas, which is the cloud solution. And let's get started with that. I'll be opening up Chrome now. Let's make this full screen. Open up a new tab, and we'll be going to mongodb.com. You need to sign in for this. I am already logged in, so it's going to take me directly to the MongoDB Atlas portal. Inside of there, this is going to show you the name of the organization, and it already has a project 0 by default because it needs to have one. So what we'll be doing is creating a new project. We click here and press the button that says new project. Inside of the new project, you can add the name of the project here. Let's call this one server MERN setup. That's fine. Also YouTube. Perfect. Go next, and then we can press the button, create project. Hopefully this won't take much time. All right, so it brings us here. Now the first thing that we need to do, which is also going to take some time, is build a database. So we press build a database. Since this is a personal project, you guys could also use the free shared version, and I'll be using the same. Let's go with create. create a shared cluster. It gives us some of the information. You could choose a particular cloud provider and some of the other information, but it doesn't really make a difference. So we're going to skip through that and press the create cluster button, and that should get it started. So it says your cluster is being created. New cluster takes between 1 to 3 minutes to provision. Meanwhile, we can do two things. So what we need is to access this database from our project. So there's two. So the first thing would be to allow to whitelist the IPs, for which we'll go to network access. Inside of that, it says add an IP address. So press add IP address. So if you're working in a team, you could whitelist some of your IP addresses, or if you're just a single person, you can add your IP. Or if you're somebody like me who's just doing this for the YouTube and won't be continuing with the project, I'll just say allow access from anywhere. And this way, anybody can access this project now. It automatically adds the IP address, and I can just simply press confirm. And all right, it says we'll only be able to connect. Yeah, perfect. So this should be enough for that. So we also need to create a database user, which is basically how we connect the project. So for that, let's create a new add new database user. Let's give this the name you suck at coding. For the password, you can enter something of your own, or if you don't like to do that, you can press auto generate secure password, which basically creates a random password that you could just copy and keep. You need to make sure that you don't forget it, because it's not going to give you the password again, and you'll have to create a new user, delete this one, however that works. So we'll be copying it. I've saved it in my notes, and I'll be doing add user now. So this has created a user, you suck at coding, with the admin access, has all of the resources, and that's enough. Now let's go back to the databases and see where that is. So it's still taking some time. So I'm going to wait for this one to complete, and we will be back once it is done. All right, so the cluster is now successfully created. What I'm going to do is press this button that says connect, and it gives me a bunch of options to connect it. And what we're going to do today is basically connect our application. So we press the second option, and it says driver NodeJS version 4.0 or later. Perfect. So this is the MongoDB URI that we'll be needing in order to connect the application. We can simply copy it from here, and it says that we need to replace the keyword password with the actual password which was given to us for this user that we created earlier, which I have copied in my notes. So no problems. Let's copy this. Let's make sure we've copied it, and we can close this now. For now, let's get rid of this. We'll come back to it. So here we are in the app.js again, and now what we can do is go ahead and add this Mongo URI. So let's say mongoose.connect. In order to connect to the Mongoose, this is where the URI goes. So I'm just going to call it URI for now, because what we want is to access the URI from the .env file. So we'll leave this for now. Add an object with some of the options that are needed. Use new URL parser, like that, and use unified topology. Set to true. And what we want now is to promise. We do not need the response from here, but what we want is to validate that the DB is connected. So we'll add a console log that we'll be seeing down in the terminal once it's connected, which will say DB connected. All right, and if it is not connected or there's an error, let's do a catch the error basically, and we'll do a console log again that says DB connection error, and prints the error so that we can debug it. So where the URI is, what I'm going to do now is create a file. It's called .env, and inside of that, forgot. Let's add the port too, right? Forgot that I was to add that. So there's the port and I'm gonna say, right, Mongo URI, and this is where I'm gonna paste the entire URI. Where the password is, I am going to quickly add the password over here, and then I'm gonna move on to the app.js. All right, so I've added the password. Okay, so let's now, similar to the port, do process.env, and we call it mongo_URI. And now it says server is running on port 8080, and it also says DB connected. That means that we've successfully connected the MongoDB Atlas, the cloud solution, to this application. We won't be creating an API that tests the DB as well, but what I'm going to do next is to create a test API just so we can see that the front end and the back end are coming together and communicating with each other. So for that, let's create some folders. So this is how I like to set up the backend. Inside of the server, I'm going to call controllers. Right? We have controllers. Let's do models for the schemas. Let's do middlewares for any of the auth checks or whatever middleware that you're using for your application. And then the routes. Perfect. So inside of the routes, I'm going to create a file. Let's call it test.js. And let's set up a route. So we'll be importing express again. Const require express. We'll set up a router, which is from express. And over here, what I like to do is import any of the controllers, and then import any middleware that is needed for the API. Middlewares. And finally, this is where we write the API routes. So let's do a GET request. We'll just be sending some sample data and see it in the front end. So let's do router.get/test. And over here, we'll be adding the controller. So what we could do is write the function in itself over here with a request, response, and an arrow function. And this would run for the test. But what I like to do is divide things into controllers and middlewares and routes so that it's nice and clean when the size of the code base increases significantly. So we won't be doing this. For now, I'm just going to leave it here and go back to actually controllers. Inside of controllers, let's create a file with the same name, which is test.js. And over here, let's write a controller that says get test. That should be fine. Let's do an async function as the arguments request, response. And what it's going to do is simply give a status of 200 and give a message in JSON form that test API is working. Perfect. So that's our controller that now we'll be importing inside of the routes test.js file. So I do const curly brackets get test, which is the name of the controller, is equal to require. So we want to move back a file. So this is where we'll find controllers and test. And over here, rather than adding the controller itself, what I'll be doing is just write get test. And that should do it. All right, so what we need to do is complete the routes file. I still have to export it so that it's accessible inside of the app.js, where we'll be adding the test routes. So all of the routes that we create inside of this test.js file, which could be post, get, put, delete, multiple of those files, would be accessible inside of the routes. And I'll be showing now how to do that. So we do a module.exports router, and now we are going to access this inside of the app.js file over here. So inside of routes, what we do is const, let's call them So all of the routes would be accessible this way. I'll write test routes for the name, do a require routes test, and all of the routes that are right inside of this would be accessible by doing app.use / and then write test routes. Okay. Let's see what the problem is. It says, oh, messed up the spelling for require, which is inside the test.js. My bad with that. Okay, so servers are running on port 8080 DB connected. That means everything's working fine. We could test the API using Postman, but I think it's a fairly simple one, and I'm almost certain that it'll work. So let's just simply go to the front end and call this API and see if it's working. So this is all that we have for backend. Let's now make it to the left, open up the React app, move this one to the right, and inside of the React app, I'm going to minimize or collapse the server inside of source app.jsx. So what I'll be doing is fetching the results from the API /test that we created. And for that, I'm going to define a function. Let's create a folder and call it functions. Inside of functions, let's do a file again that says test.js. And over here, we'll be writing the function that fetches it. And the workflow is going to be that as soon as we hit the API /test, this text hello world should change to the message that we get. And for that, we'll be needing a state, and we'll be needing the use effect hook to fetch the API. So I'm going to do import, so use state, use effect from React. Perfect. Let's do a state. Let's call it data. Set data and use state, and we can keep the initial value equivalent to hello world. All right, let's see if we can get the data. So this is the initial value, and this is going to change with the results that we get from the server. So let's do a use effect, shall we? We want this to run just once. So we'll add a dependency, an empty dependency array. Inside of here, we'll be running the function. So for that, let's go ahead and write the function in test.js. So I'll do export const get test. Let's keep the name same, and async, and we'll be doing it, adding it inside the try catch. For any errors you might get, let's do a const response, and we do await fetch, which is the JavaScript way of communicating with an API. You could also use like Axios or any of the other packages that are really popular, but I like to keep things simple and use the JavaScript way of doing it. So this is where we can actually write the API. For that, we could use the .env again, where we can store the React app, the React backend URL. But for simplicity's sakes, I'm going to skip that for front end and simply write what the API URL is. It's http localhost 8080/test. And let's add some options now. So we'll do a method get and add some headers. Say accepts JSON. Let's do content type, application JSON. So we get the results, convert this to, so we return this to the file. This function returns the response, converts it to JSON basically, and then returns the response. So now we can go back to app.jsx. This is what we needed to fetch it. Inside of the use effect hook, which runs as soon as the app loads, first of all, we import the function. So let's do functions, import get test from functions and test. Perfect. So inside of the use effect, what I want is to call this method. Oh, perfect. Gave us a dot then too. Also do a dot catch. In case there's an error, we'll just simply add a console log for this one. And inside of then, what I'm going to do is set the data to the, like that, let's do response dot message, which was the message that we were getting. Okay, I'm just going to fix this quick error that we got. Oh, says test API is working. Perfect. All right, so that is about it. Thank you so much for watching and have a good one.